Hi guys, another video lesson from me. This time you guessed it, it's Japanese music. As I found more success with the OneDrive thing, you should find a link to the OneDrive playlist in the assignment on Edmodo. Remember, as soon as you start the quiz, it will automatically submit it to me if you don't complete it by the time limit that I've set. If you do it by accident, I'll notice if there's lots of wrong answers. I hope it's an accident, and what I'll do is automatically reset it and ask that you do this lesson again, okay? So make sure you're only doing this when you are ready. As ever, make sure you do make good notes and let me know if there's anything you struggle to understand. Okay, moving on, we're going to do our listening question. We've been doing this at the start of each of these lessons. What you'll need to do is answer questions 1 to 8 on the Edmodo quiz, as well as use track 1 in the playlist. I've put the questions up here for you, but I'd like you to hit pause now to complete the listening test. Okay, so assuming that you've done that, what I've got now are the answers for you. Okay, so I'm not going to spend loads of time on this, but a couple of things to bear in mind. In terms of device, we've talked about pedals, so sustained notes or repeated notes. And when they're in the highest voice, we say it's inverted. So that's why it's an inverted pedal and not just simply a pedal. Normally we use the words tonic and dominant to describe the function of the pedal, but I haven't asked you to do that here. In terms of the form, this is a great example of a rondo form, and it's a classic example using the 3 contrasting sections A, B, C, but you always come back to the A after the new sections. If you got this wrong, I would say please go back and have a listen. You really need to be confident with recognizing these types of forms by now. Another couple of important things are the examples, the reasons for your answer. Now, there are others, but these are some that you should kind of default with. For example, when you're talking about Baroque music, you quite often will say string-dominated orchestra or in terms of terrace dynamics, for example. These are some typical answers for classical music, okay? And of course, this piece was written by Mozart, but Mozart and Haydn are two easy or safe bets in terms of possible composers. Right. Okay, so moving on to the main part of a lesson, and again, you need to be making notes. We are focusing on Japanese music. So to begin with, as a generalization, a lot of traditional music from East Asia relies on words, and pieces do usually have quite descriptive titles. In fact, many traditional Japanese folk melodies were written for voice originally and then adapted for instruments. Often these are also said to the instruments that are played are said to reflect the voice. And so you hear lots of interesting effects to give the impression of vocal melody. There are very distinctive characteristics to different types of traditional Japanese music, and luckily you do not need to know these. It's just useful to listen to different types of Japanese music, as any style could potentially come up on the exam. Some key things across the music quite often includes the fact that there's no chordal harmony. So traditionally, we wouldn't be dealing with chords, we'd be dealing with different melody layers and rhythm layers stacked on top of each other. And the melodies or the melodic parts themselves quite often don't necessarily start together, but they tend to end together at cadence points. And remember, when we're talking about cadences in Western music, we think of the end of phrases and it's marked by 2 chords. But in this sense, we're talking still about the end of phrases, but we're not necessarily thinking about chords. The music is traditionally through composed. So rather than having let's say a binary, AB, or ternary, ABA, or a rondo, ABACA, etc., rather than having that kind of structure, we'd go from one idea to a new idea to a new idea. And you might hint at earlier things, but a crude way to think of it would be like A, B, C, D, E, etc., depending on how long the piece is. So that's what we mean by through composed. Now, I want you to kind of think about this as you listen to your first example of Japanese music. You've got 3 questions to answer on Edmodo, but I also want you to think about this last question, okay? Which is, which key features from before, so before this slide, do you hear in this example? So pause the video and have a go answering these questions. Right, so again, hopefully you have done that. If not, please do, because this is for you. It's not useful to cheat. But anyway, so firstly, hopefully you heard that there were 2 instruments in this example. The first instrument, well, depending on the order, it doesn't really matter, is plucked, and it's the koto. And the second instrument is bowed, and it's kokyo. I don't know how to say it, but I know how to write it, and that's the main thing. Now, by this point, you might be thinking, there's some similarities here between Japanese and Chinese music, and you would be correct. Oh, wow, that works today. Okay. The reason is, quite bluntly, a lot of the cultural traditions were influenced from ancient China as there was migration to what we call Japan. So a lot of the instruments are actually very similar looking, very similar sounding. So this is where we've got to be a little bit careful when on the exam people do sometimes struggle to differentiate between Japanese and Chinese music, and it's something that we will need to have a go at. Okay, so in terms of the texture, you may have got the fact that it's heterophonic, and this is a really good example in track 2 of a heterophonic texture, because you can hear 2 instruments sort of playing together, playing the same melody, but one instrument is playing more notes, one is playing less notes. That's a sort of crude way to think of it, but that's, again, a good example of a heterophonic texture. You may have also noticed that there was no chordal harmony in this extract, and it was through composed. To a certain degree, you might say that the melody, again, didn't necessarily start together because, of course, it's a heterophonic texture. But we do hear points where the 2 instruments play together at the end of phrases. So, in fact, you could argue that the 3 points that I made before are all evident in this example of music. Okay, we're actually going to hear another piece of music go straight into another listening task. And you've got some more questions to think on, the ones in red, as well as question 12 on Edmodo, which is, in what ways is this example different from the last? Consider the typical features. So pause the video now and have a go at addressing question 12. Think about these other 2 questions here, and make sure it's track 3 on the playlist. Okay, again, hopefully you have done that, so I'm going to move on. Now, whilst this whole sort of traditional aesthetic is very much respected and still practiced in Japan, you might know, if you've ever been, Japan is a very forward-thinking country, and has very much led the way in terms of technology and innovation, and that's definitely true in music. The extract that we just listened to actually does have unison melodies, but also chordal accompaniments, and you could argue that there were influences from the West in terms of the accompaniment. There were some playing techniques such as the strumming and the fast strumming, which was tremolo-like, and this actually was probably heavily influenced again by Western music. Interestingly, the title of the piece comes from the Japanese word which for stream. Again, I'm not going to embarrass myself and have a go at saying that. And the fast tremolo effect heard in the string instruments is probably trying to reflect this idea of water musically. Right, so there are lots of instruments in Japanese music. You're very lucky because you only need to name 3 in the exam, okay? The first one here that we've got is the koto, which is a plucked string instrument, very similar to the guqin and the gujeng. Don't laugh at my pronunciation. And the reason is because it's essentially the same instrument. It's been brought over, or it was brought over, and then used, has been used for a long time in Japanese music. Now, if you need to have a listen, I'll pause the video and head on to YouTube or Youku, see if you can get some extracts of playing here. The next instrument you need to know is the shakuhachi, and you can see it's a long end-blown bamboo flute. Similarly, if you want to pause, make a note of this, or head on to YouTube, then do so. The last instrument that you need to know, I'm not entirely sure. I've never known how to say it. I've always called it the show. It definitely isn't pronounced that way, is it? If you have a look at it, you may recognise it as again, another Chinese instrument which is very similar, which I believe is the sheng. It's Sheng. If I'm incorrect with my pronunciation, please do send me a message, because obviously I want to be a master of Chinese. Again, pause the video if you need to make a note of it. But these are the 3 instruments that you need to know. So there are plenty of videos on the internet of those instruments. It's important that you can recognise them. So what I want you to do is listen to track 4 and answer question 13 on Edmodo. You've got essentially on the same track, which is track 4, you've got 3 extracts of music, A, B and C. I've given you the rough timings of those, but hopefully you can hear they are quite different instruments. And you've got to decide which instrument comes in first. So which is the A instrument, the B and the C. So there's a matching task on Edmodo. Pause the video now and have a go at doing that. That is question 13. Right, I'm hoping, that's not a word. I'm hoping you've done that successfully. If not, boo to you, but we're going to go on now. You may have already picked up on this in terms of texture, that the music is quite often heterophonic. Now, again, I need to be careful because I'm noticing a trend that where I say X music has X texture, you're not always listening, because whilst we may have we expect a heterophonic texture in Japanese music, there's no reason why there can't be a monophonic texture, or even in more contemporary examples, like the earlier track we heard, you might have chordal, so homophonic style texture, okay? But this is your go-to, your safe bet if you're not sure, but please, it's important to use your ears. Next thing, in terms of scales, quite often we do hear pentatonic scales, or if we can hear more notes and it doesn't sound quite major or minor, it's a safe bet to say modal, because there are discrete types of scale that are heard in Japanese music which you don't need to identify. And you could be interested in it, but for now I wouldn't worry too much, okay? Now, I did say at the very beginning that there are discrete types of Japanese music, and one of them is gagaku, which is court music, so quite formal music, quite theatrical. You don't need to be able to recognise whether music is in this genre. However, it's important to listen to some, because there have been several extracts on exams in the past. So what I want you to do is simply pause the video, listen to track 5, and consider all the elements that we've already discussed. I don't know if you can hear that in the background, but I'm in England right now and I can hear an ice cream van. They sound quite creepy, but it's a cultural heritage, you might say. Anyway, moving on. Key features. This is the daddy slide. Not so much information here, but again, a summary of all the things that I've discussed in this video so far. So there are no chords, or there isn't chordal harmony. The music's through composed. It is heterophonic, or there are different versions of the melody, and use of pitch bends. Now, hopefully, this idea you heard particularly in track 5. There were some really good examples of ornaments used, particularly pitch bends, in that track. Okay, if you haven't already, pause the video and make sure you've got these notes down, because these are good exam answers. But we're going to move on. The final part of the lesson is, of course, an exam question. You've got to answer questions 14 to 17 on the quiz and use track 6 to do this, okay? So I've slimmed this down to, again, the bare bones, all the information you need for IGCSE. If we were in school, we would do a little bit more experimentation with this, but for now, let's focus on what we need to know. If you do have any problems or questions, or something doesn't make sense, it's really important that you send me a message, and then I can help you with that. But for now, have a go at this, and I look forward to seeing some work from you. All right, guys, thank you very much.